Hey, Jeannie, who's our guest on the Energy Nerd Show this week?
Today we have Smitty, Tom Smith from Austin.
Good to see you, Smitty.
Good to see you all. It's been way too long.
Where are you?
I'm in Austin, Texas, and for 30 odd years, I ran a group called Public Citizen, which was an environmental and consumer group, and worked with them while we were talking about deregulating the electric utility system. And we're seeing one of the big flaws that has resulted from deregulation that has played out here in Texas over the last month, called the Big Freeze, and or snow cane, as it's frequently called down here because we have so many hurricanes. Haven't seen anything like this before. And I'm delighted to talk with you about what happened and maybe how we can prevent it in the future.
That would be great. Well, as a Texan, I'm always watching Texas news, but this is really something that everyone had their eyes on. And I think one thing we're all really curious about is, what types of capacity went out? You have one really great graph here showing us. What can you tell us about that?
So while there's been a lot of discussion that the rolling blackouts, which had affected about 4.3 million households, or a total of about 9.5 million Texans, were caused by wind and solar not performing, what this graph actually shows is something much different. What you see is that there were a number of reasons why the crisis occurred in the early morning hours around 1:30 on the 15th. But one of the biggest problems were the coal and gas plants freezing up for a variety of reasons and being unable to deliver the energy that was necessary. ERCOT has a total capacity of about 107,000 megawatts, and 48% of it, or roughly 52,000 megawatts, went down because they froze or because the fuel supplies froze. Oftentimes what you found was that the gauges and electronic controls literally froze up. It was in North Texas, -5 degrees below zero, in Central Texas, where I live, 5. And the entire system had been weatherized to 10 degrees above zero, which for us is a very cold period of time. But what we really did not expect, to the extent that it happened, was that the coal piles froze and that the natural gas supply system cratered. And that's what that green line is. And this shows you the more that's on that chart, the more plants that went out. And that about a third of all the gas supplies in Texas went down because the wellheads were frozen, because the compressors were not able to operate because they didn't have electricity, or because the power plant itself froze. And so when you look at the real root cause, it was the so-called reliable, dispatchable gas plants that failed, followed by the coal plants, and then some renewables, and then the nuke went down in the middle of this storm too. One of our 4 nuclear units froze up and went down. So there were a lot of reasons why this happened. The sad news is that this was predictable and preventable. This is not the first deep freeze that Texas has had. We had them in 1989, 2011, 2014, and then a portion of the state went black in 2018 as a result of freezing temperatures, primarily to the east of here. And after each of the events, the federal NERC and FERC people, the people who worry about grid reliability, studied the issue, came in and recommended that Texas weatherize their plants. And they failed to do that. Finally, by 2018, the people at NERC had just had it and said, the legislature needs to mandate it. And they did not do that. So as a result, we went black. And the tragedy is that it has been the most costly disaster in Texas history. The numbers are still being counted. We still have a large number of broken pipes and water mains that are left unrepaired. And we had 128 people dead as a result of this disaster. It's still counting. And the estimates are somewhere in the neighborhood of 195 to maybe as much as $295 billion in damages. So It's going to be an enormous problem. We have utility companies going bankrupt, and the bills are going to be high for the remaining residual consumers.
So in terms of the causes, kind of the cold weather, and then if we look at the graph, you see the gas plant outages jumping in just a few hours from like 12,000 megawatts up over 25,000 megawatts. And you're saying that was largely because of the effects of the cold weather and the lack of weatherization preparedness at the plants. Can you explain a little more like what that would be? Like what would weatherization at a gas plant, if it were being done prudently and ahead of time, what would that look like?
Most of us think of weatherization in the cold winter as literally putting on a coat and going outside. And to the north and the west of here, when you travel, you see gas wellheads and other things that stick up out of the ground that literally have jackets on. That's the easiest and cheapest thing to do. But most of us, even in Texas, make sure we have plenty of antifreeze in our systems and our automobiles in the wintertime. And the cheapest and easiest thing to do would have been to install a $2,800 manifold just before the gas wellhead and inject glycol, which is the same basic product we use as antifreeze, into the gas when the temperatures began to drop down below zero to keep that wellhead from freezing. Another cheap thing to do would have been to make sure that the compressor stations were powered. And one of the alarming things is that nobody in the regulatory structure required any proof that the compressors had notified their Electric Reliability Council that they were critical infrastructure. And ERCOT turned them off in order to lighten the load because they didn't know what the load was and didn't know to protect them and how essential it was for the generation system.
But so then when the compressors are off, then it hinders the gas supply to the plants, and then you get this escalating problem.
Right. We don't know for sure and won't for probably 60 days how much of the problem was due to that. But in previous episodes, we know that somewhere between 6 and 25% of the gas plants tripped off because they didn't have adequate pressure, whether the compressor stations weren't running or whether the compressor stations were some other system failure coming from the gas wellhead may have occurred to reduce supplies.
The description of the problem makes it sound like it's not that hard to avoid this in the future, or at least make it less common and less of a deep crisis in the future, even if there were cold weather again.
There have been a number of studies done by the Gas Research Institute and many of our academic institutions here that say the cost of weatherization is relatively little. We have roughly 300,000 wells here in Texas, and our best guess is, based on the GRI data, that you could have weatherized those gas wells for about $750 million, which isn't cheap. But by comparison to the many billions of dollars that we lost and lives lost, it's pennies on the dollar, and we should have done that. And it's also true with our big coal plants and our nuke plant. Each of those failed because of problems we've seen in the past with inadequate weatherization, particularly on meters and gauges. And what you see in the north and other places is a proactive pattern of putting heat tape on, just like those of us who lived up north over the years will wrap our most vulnerable pipes in electric tape to keep them warm and not from freezing, or put basically barriers around those gauges. And the Vistra companies and their luminant generation spent $8 million in about a week before the thing building barriers around their vulnerable gauges and found that that worked very well. They had fewer outages than others in the system, and they actually performed better than they were expected to during the outage because they'd taken steps to do an emergency weatherization program.
So all this could have been prevented. Why didn't the Texas legislature act when NERC said they should?
Simply money. The gas companies and the electric generating companies are some of the biggest contributors to the legislators, and they were told and bought the argument that if you make us do it, we won't be competitive. Well, competitive with whom? This is an islanded grid here in Texas, and we're not in competition with Oklahoma or New Mexico. And even if we were, their utilities were all required to do that. So it was just a matter of the utility companies not wanting to do it, using their political influence to get their way, and a belief that it'll never happen again. But what's most alarming about this is that it will happen again, and our state climatologist has said that we know the weather is changing, and what we can expect in the future is significantly more frequent storms, winter storms, higher temperatures in the summer leading to heat waves. We had a period several years ago where it was more than 100 degrees for 90 days here in Austin, resulting in drought, which means inadequate water for cooling ponds, or the water that's in the cooling ponds being too hot to be effective. What we expect is more frequent hurricanes, which will also have significant and devastating impacts on the electric grid as our power lines are down and as some of our plants are swamped.
So we could expect extreme weather in the future, summer and winter, and drought and so on. What would you say needs to be done going forward?
That's probably the best place to start, is we need to prepare for the future by looking into the future as opposed to looking retroactively at the worst storms that have happened in the past, because we know it's going to get worse. Two, we're at a verge where there are all kinds of new technologies that are going to be available that can help us abate these kinds of storms. Things like big battery storage systems, electric vehicles, demand side management, where you can use your smart appliances or dispatch significant large industrial loads to reduce peak demand or reduce overall demand in these big freezes. There are a wide range of other things that can be done as well that will end up helping us save energy by utilizing more of the renewable resources all across the state, as opposed to just relying on the vast majority of them that are currently out in West Texas. And as we begin to develop more additional coastal winds, those outperformed their expectations all the way through the storm. And we are beginning to have people exploring offshore wind as well, which will be far less susceptible to freezes.
I've heard people complaining about electric vehicles, and with all these power outages, we can't depend on electric vehicles. We'd be better off with traditional gas transportation. What would you say to that?
We had the same problem. Without electricity, many of the gas stations and gas pumps weren't working either. But for many, electric vehicles were a lifesaver. And as we emerge into the future, where you have a significant percentage, it's going to be like having a storage battery in every garage. One of the favorite stories in the Twitter world were a family who had a young baby who was ill. Their power went off. They climbed into their Tesla, flipped it onto camping mode, and was able to ride through the storm for several nights in a row, keeping their baby and themselves warm and their dog, and recharging the car from the solar panels on the roof during the day. My wife and I looked at this, and we have a new Nissan Leaf with a 62 kilowatt hour battery. The manual said we could have survived for 30 hours in that car at medium heat, which keeps us in the mid 60s as best I could tell. And when you start to get hundreds of thousands of these electric vehicles, they can provide significant grid resilience. Let's take a look at, say, the city of Houston. If their vehicles, if all their bus fleet had been electrified, they could have rolled it out and provided 1,300 warming stations that people could climb into for an hour or so, recharge their electronics, get caught up on communications, and then they could have moved on to yet another community. And as we start to get significant penetration of heavy-duty electric vehicles in our distribution fleets and our trucking fleets, those vehicle batteries will be available to provide backup services as well. So it's going to be a tremendous asset if we deploy it smartly.
I love the idea of distributed energy resources all over Texas and clean. And I think that's a topic for another nerd show.
Thanks for telling us about Texas. This is really interesting.
Well, I'll be more than happy to visit with you again. Thanks for inviting me. We're now at the point where the storm has gone and the sun shines out, and we're starting to get wildflowers. So I hope you all get the chance to come down and visit us.
Nice. Here's Jeannie's car.
Oh, you see my Tesla out
Here's,
there?
that one's Jeannie's car.
Cool. All right, y'all. Take care.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for watching. This is Energy Nerd Show and Tell.
It's the show that we want to watch, so we're thinking maybe some of you energy nerds want to watch it too. If you do, then hey, tell your friends and subscribe right around here. Click there,
And check
or there, or over here.
Instagram and Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and where
Yeah,
else?
and the Energy Nerd website at energynerdshow.com. You can always go there. And if you want to be a guest, you can volunteer to be a guest. We love to have guests. In fact, that's kind of what the show is all about.
Absolutely.